It's absolutely my pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jennifer Finn. Jennifer Finn is now an associate professor. I saw, congratulations.
Thank you.
The history department at Marquette University. Her research ranges widely over the ancient Near Eastern and over the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, focusing on ancient kingship, historiography, cultural interactions between Greece and the Near East, and much, much more. Her first book, Much Ado About Marduk, examined Akkadian texts that challenged royal policy, whereas her current book project, History Rewritten, Revisionism, the Age of Alexander the Great, focuses on how Alexander the Great and those who wrote about him after his death changed standard narratives about Mediterranean history. If you're surprised that one person works across these different and highly specialized fields, you shouldn't be. It's incredibly rare. And indeed, Professor Finn holds 2 PhDs, one in Greek and Roman history from the University of Michigan, and another in Assyriology and ancient history from the University of Munich, both incredibly top schools in their respective fields. We're excited to have her with us this afternoon to give a paper entitled Ancient Near Eastern Military Empires and the Origins of Narrative Silencing. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thanks. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really honored to be invited and in such distinguished company today and also tomorrow. So as I said, I'm for the first time using this 2-screen model so that I can have a look at the PowerPoint that you're seeing, but then also the paper that I want to give to you. So no promises there won't be some glitches along the way, but we're going to do our best here. So let me just see if I can change my slides. So are you able to see the first one? Where to find some ancient Near Eastern fake news? Is that a thumbs up? Perfect. Okay, good. So really, I want to talk to you today about fake news. And this is a topic that is really in our consciousness at this moment. But what I want to sort of argue to you is that this is not just a modern concept, but it's also an ancient one, and that it actually goes back as far as the ancient Near East. Today, we describe this so-called new phenomenon as the post-truth era. At least this is what I've been seeing when I've been doing some reading on this, that people are calling this post-truth era. But really, the creation of this sort of fake news enterprise and what I sort of characterize as the submersion of alternative discourses, because that's really sort of what it is. And that can be in sort of a physical or also a literary format. This is common practice in the ancient Near East. And so what I really want to do today is talk to you about what that looked like in the ancient Near East, at least from my perspective. We see this commonly, some people have done studies on this type of thing, particularly in the classical world. So for instance, in Athens, you see very clearly that this Greek city-state constructs a very sort of definitive narrative for herself that's based on her military success. And that martial success is going to become the hinge point for a lot of similar kinds of discourses in later sort of classical periods. But also, as I want to sort of argue to you today, in the ancient Near East, it is the military around which a lot of these narratives are both produced, but also silenced. So there's really sort of an overwhelming focus in the 3rd millennia, or in the last really 3 millennia before the Common Era, on royal initiatives. That's really a lot of what we have. We have a lot of these sort of royal pronouncements of royal prerogatives, and this is the sort of elite perspective that we're looking at most of the time. And when we're seeing these kind of elite perspectives or narratives, these seem to us, in many cases, to be excessively laudatory, although maybe sort of in recent political times they wouldn't look so excessively laudatory because we're getting these sort of self-panegyrics now as well. But again, these really focus, because of the nature of ancient Near Eastern divine mandate in royal kingship, on military affairs. So I want to just sort of look very quickly at what some of those discourses could look like. We see these types of pronouncements in all sorts of different texts, including royal inscriptions. We see them in annals, we see them in epic texts, and we also see them in monuments. So I just wanted to give you sort of a very broad range. Actually, some of these texts and monuments were discussed earlier in the last talk, very briefly. I want to give you sort of an idea of what this range looks like here. So, for instance, one of the most famous pieces of monumental art from the ancient Near East is this so-called Victory Stele of Naram Sin. And this depicts the king's victory over the Lulubi people. And we have this sort of motif of the king, sort of standing in high relief over all of these defeated enemies. We also have, so this is a very sort of artistic pronouncement of a king's dominance over another people. We also have in later periods these so-called Amarna letters. So these are correspondences between ancient kings in the Near East, really giving us a view into what this sort of international brotherhood of kings is what Amanda Podani calls it. It looks like, especially in the 14th century, so the 1300s or so. Then we also have, particularly in the Assyrian period, we have these annals where the kings really sort of go into great detail about their military victories, the way that they sort of carried out these victories on behalf of the gods mandated that they do these things. And they give us lots of gross details about how they defeated these people and what the sort of razing of their cities, for instance, entailed. And then when you get to even later periods, I've given you on the left-hand side here an example from the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This, of course, is the Bisitun monument of Darius, which most people don't really recognize as actually, it's so far, I had the great pleasure of seeing this in person. It is so far away from you that you can barely see anything at all. This is as close as I could zoom in with my camera. So this kind of pronouncement is really sort of meant for the gods, but it's a piece of propaganda in the sense that you know when you're looking up at this thing that you can't see it and you can't read it, and it's meant for the gods. Although we do, of course, know that there are copies of this thing disseminated throughout the Persian Empire. So there's that as well. But this is really sort of the closest thing that we have to an Achaemenid Persian historiography, because they just don't write texts about themselves. But in all of these cases, we get this these sort of propagandistic statements that are really based around the king's military prowess. So all of these sort of public pronouncements of Near Eastern kings really regarding the outcome of internationally significant battles have the effect, I really want to argue here, of creating not one, but actually two or even more accounts. One about who the winner of the battle is or the engagement is, and yet another account about who the loser is, the so-called loser. This former account, the one about who the winner of a battle or a war is often a really revisionist document. It sometimes deliberately and actively sort of submerges that alternative version that you might hear from the other side. So this is the creation of a counter discourse in many cases, and that's what I want to sort of talk about today. That, however, that whole idea, that's not revolutionary. That really shouldn't surprise us because many of you may know Triot. He has theorized that any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences. But we're talking about this in terms of more modern historiography, and I want to apply this instead to more ancient, very ancient historiography. So that alternative, or what I'd like to call a submerged discourse, the one that sort of the loser might want to propagate about their role in that battle, really does, in their discourse, allow them to assert that they had been victorious in exactly that same battle. Now, in some of these cases, we can recover the so-called submerged account, and so those are the ones that I really want to sort of talk about. In other cases, we can not necessarily fully recover that submerged account, but we can reconstruct it circumstantially, even if it wasn't necessarily intended for circulation and transmission. So here I want to deal with a few examples of this phenomenon where we retain both the submerged and what I like to call the submersive discourse. So the one that seems to be sort of pushed down by propaganda, and the one that we see very clearly before our eyes, the very propagandistic "I won this battle" kind of discourse. So in each of these cases, what we're looking at here is really, it's an age-old phenomenon. It's biased history. So in the Near East, I want to say, these biased histories, and I've separated these into a couple of categories that we'll look at in a minute, can appear in several forms. That's going to be most often as a monument or a text, or a combination of the two where we have text on the monument, but also as epistolography. And so that's going to be where something like the Amarna letters will come into play. So I'm going to argue that this phenomenon is really a direct result of the increasing complexity of international relations in the age of ancient Near Eastern empires. It is because we have more contact between these royal spheres in different areas of the ancient Near East that we now get to see this phenomenon of ancient fake news really kind of come to the fore. So this, what I want to sort of show you today, reflects a historiographic dialogic that necessitates, by its very nature, the introduction of a new concept of interpretive history. So we're really sort of asking a lot out of these ancient Near Eastern texts, but I think that we should try to see if they're doing the same types of sort of historiographic games that we play with our own histories. So the way that I've divided this is into a couple of categories. This is my first category. It's kind of broad, but I want to show you where I'm going with this. My first category is, this is my title here, and it's not short, Selective Omissions, Hyperbolic Statements, and Other Games We Play with History. So this is what the first category of texts that we can sort of define as these sort of submersive and submerged texts. And here we have evidence for a very sort of dialogic, discursive argument back and forth between these two very powerful city-states in the early dynastic III period. And this occurs in a border dispute that's between the two city-states of Lagash and Umma. So this is probably maybe familiar to some of you. These are two really important settlements in ancient Sumer. And the conflict around which these arise comes about in the 3rd millennium BC. So this is a very, very early example of this phenomenon that I'm talking about. Very often people have referred to this, Gerald Cooper, for instance, has referred to this as the first documented war in human history. So if that's true, our first documented war in human history is already doing the fake news that we have up until this modern era. So the arbitration of this border between Lagash and Umma in the Lagash accounts, so this is one account here, is usually attributed to Mesilim, the king of Kish. So that's around 2600 BC. And this surrounds the ownership of an area that is referred to as the Guedna. Okay, so that's how we talk about the land that is being disputed here. The dispute over this border was represented as a matter decided by Enlil between the chief gods of Lagash and Umma, who are Ningirsu and Shara, respectively. And Cooper has described this as a lease arrangement whereby it was agreed that the grain of Ningirsu could be cultivated by Umma so long as part of that grain was returned in rent and interest. Okay, so there is a sort of agreement made between these two cities here. The conflict over this border far outlasts the reign of this one king, Maysilim, and it was settled through the introduction of a series of oaths known to us from the most famous attestation of the conflict, which occurs in the Stele of the Vultures. So you see that on the sort of bottom right-hand side of your screen here. This is one of the most famous pieces of art from the ancient Near East. And you'll see that it's dated around 2460 BC. And if we started this conflict around 2600, you can really tell that this border conflict between Lagash and Umma is ongoing for over 100 years. This stele records the status of the conflict as it was inherited by Ayanatum in 2460 BC. And it contains a really sort of elaborate pictorial narrative with a really long text, which describes the Lagashite king's victory over a leader from Umma. So we're still talking about military conflicts between the kings of these two cities. We are told repeatedly in this text that the leader of Umma defied Lagash, and that throughout the text, the leader of Umma is made to swear several oaths, stating that he will not transgress the territory of the god Ningirsu, that he will not shift the course of the irrigation channels and canals, and that he will not destroy the monuments on the border. So Irene Winter, a very, very famous art historian, describes this stele as the first monument that could be identified as public, historical, and narrative with a pointed, state-sponsored political agenda. It presents the legitimate claim of Lagash over that territory, the Gu Adna, and it constitutes according to her, instructed rhetoric intended to provide witness to a very selected truth. Okay, so this, I hope I've sort of laid out on the slide here, for those of you who might not be as familiar, what really is at stake here. And this conflict really doesn't come to an end until the king of Umma, Lugal-Zagassi, this is in 2294 to 2270. So what we're really talking about here is 300 years of warfare. Inflicts a defeat on Uruk-Hagina, the king of Lagash, in his 8th year on the throne. Okay, so this is a very, very long span of time. We don't have documents from the entire span of time, but the really quite interesting thing about this is that in 1983, Gerald Cooper collected our main sources for this conflict, which largely come from Lagash and nearby Girsu, and present the issue from the perspective of Lagash. So we get this really one-sided perspective, which means that it's going to be difficult to recover the assessment of this conflict from Umma's point of view. In other words, Umma's account has been submerged by the overwhelming amount of testimony from Lagash. However, we do have a pretty valuable text whose importance was very recently highlighted by its inclusion in the British Museum's 2019 special edition, or special exhibition, excuse me, entitled No Man's Land. So this is the artifact in question. This was kind of interesting because the exhibition placed new emphasis on what they referred to as a vase. So they thought that this thing was a vase, and then later they discovered that they had been exhibiting it upside down, and that it was actually a mace head. But regardless, it still gives us, an idea of what we're looking at here. This mace head or vase, whatever side you're on, that discussed the Lagash-Umma border conflict actually comes from the perspective of Umma. So this is the first time that we really get an idea of what Umma's side of things was during this conflict. The Umma inscription, we don't know about the provenance here, describes the refoundation of the boundary by an Umayyad king around 2400 BC or so. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of this inscription that we have from here. This begins as a panegyric to the king before it details the measurements by which the god Shara had demarcated the frontier. Gishakidu, this is the Umayyad king around 2400, is given credit for constructing a dike on the boundary, erecting its monument, making its levee prominent, and restoring its monuments. And this is really interesting because if you remember, all of these actions can be directly contrasted to the age-old insistence in all of the Lagash inscriptions that their kings had erected the boundary monument. So this serves as a really sort of direct counterbalance to the oath that the Umayyad leader is made to take in the Stele of the Vultures. That is the sort of the most famous pronouncement from the perspective of Lagash. Unlike the Lagashite inscription, though, the Umma inscription contains no reference to the claim of the god Ningirsu on the land, because that was a sort of Lagashite addition, and it only mentions their god, Shara. Nor does it mention Umma's failure to pay its debt on the land, which seems to have been the issue that had incited Lagash to war against them in the first place. So we seem to be sort of selectively omitting pieces here, and Lagash seems to be selectively adding pieces to their accounts of this conflict. Like the Lagash example, the Umma inscription also ends with curses on those who might try to destroy the monument. The assertions of the Umma inscription are more detailed and they're more tailored to the concerns of Umma, but with its similar format and material, it appears to respond rather directly to the accusations leveled at them in the inscriptions on spheroid jars and others commissioned by the kings of Lagash over several generations of the conflict. So the reason that I bring these two texts to your attention is because they exhibit really characteristics that are common to biased histories that submerge and hence also necessitate the emergence of a counter discourse. A key element here is the emergence of a corrective to the actively submerging discourse in a subsequent period, often one which directly responds to the selective omissions or the biased allegations that cause us to perceive a one-sided outcome to the conflict. Additionally, the actively submerging discourse, in this case that would be Lagash, and the submerged discourse both, that's Umma, contain some of the same vocabulary and the same phraseology to express their versions of the situation. So this very, very early conflict between Lagash and Umma really sets the stage for a more sophisticated interplay with historical claim making that I think really sees its apex in the complicated web of international relations that we get in later periods of Mesopotamian history. So if we're going to stick with biased history, I have to go forward in time quite a bit here, but I want to sort of stay in the thematic category that I've been using. And this is still biased history, but it's much, much later in 190 BC, but we're still in the sort of realm of the Near East here. So this comes to us from a bronze plaque that's excavated from the Upper Acropolis of Pergamon in the 19th century. This plaque, which seems to have served as an applique on a belt buckle of a large statue, has recently been re-examined by Michael Taylor, who argues that it depicts the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, which was fought against the army of the Seleucid king Antiochus III and a coalition of Roman and Attalid Pergamene forces. The plaque depicts a successful cavalry onslaught by Hellenistic soldiery, whom Taylor has identified as Attalid. This representation is exceptional, given the fact that the Attalids were not known for their success against Hellenistic pikemen, except in one battle, this one. The Romans, who are shown on the plaque without shields, and are replaced by Attalid soldiers in the representation of heroic situations, had suffered on their left wing against the onslaught of Antiochus's troops, only to be salvaged by Eumenes and 800 of his horsemen. So what this means is that there's an Attalid emphasis on their contribution to this great victory, which was warranted to some extent. The plaque presents a certain version of history that's really important to the self-identification of the Attalids, and particularly to their king, Eumenes. The Attalid cavalry was responsible for defeating a Seleucid contingent of Galatian cavalry, a member of whom is suggested by his nudity on this plaque. But this contingent comprised less than 8% of the Seleucid army, and therefore its highlighting was a bit of a tough sell. In addition, the plaque very deliberately depicts the Romans as unheroic, and their part in the victory is marginalized. However, the Roman author Livy, I bet you can't believe we're talking about Livy here, but indeed we are, he tells a different story, and this should be really unsurprising to you. He is certain to remind his reader that of the 3,000 cavalry on this wing, except for the 800 Attalids, the rest were Roman. This should sound kind of like familiar modern rhetoric, right? Even though they were there, all the rest of them were Roman. Livy gives a detailed account of this battle, which ultimately did see a Roman victory, and supposedly 53,000 Seleucid dead. So he rather unsurprisingly downplays the role of the Attalid cavalry in this engagement, even though they were pivotal in the final outcome of the battle. The Romans did recognize Attalid aid in the conflict. They don't ignore it. And ultimately, they split the territory that's acquired as a result of the victory over the Seleucids between their allies in Pergamon and Rhodes. But the contingent defeated by the Attalids was, for Livy, meaningless in the context of what was a patently Roman victory. So this kind of counter-narrative is perhaps unsurprising, and it may well be representative of a much larger trend of silenced military narratives in the ancient Near East. What we have in this bronze plaque here is an inferior and alternative discourse that's exaggerated to present a challenge at the expense of a very well-known and dominant history, and that comes to us through Livy. It is marked as such by its size, location, and context. Furthermore, like the post facto chronicles produced elsewhere in the ancient Near East, the plaque reveals itself as a direct response. It is itself an artifact of submersion by its very appropriation of both Hellenistic and Roman representational forms to present a really biased snapshot of history. So those are sort of my two examples in this very broad category of hyperbolic statements and selective omissions. I want to now sort of move into something that is simpler, but has also a similar amount of examples within it. This is blatant untruths. Okay, so these are going to be lies that we're looking at here that are in the context of these sort of submerged and submersive discourses. While the presentation of this kind of biased history could be quite subtle, as we saw already, there were more explicit ways to submerge an alternative discourse in the ancient Near East. The era of communication and diplomacy that developed in the 14th and the 13th centuries BC really sort of ushered in a competitive international atmosphere that brought a new dynamic to the expression of biased martial histories. And our probably most famous example here comes from the Battle of Kadesh, which occurs in 1275 BC. This is fought in the context of a great sort of international catastrophe that occurs in the Mediterranean, often described as being precipitated by the so-called Sea Peoples. And in 1275, this battle would really come to sort of define the diplomatic narrative of the ancient Near East. And it's fought between the Egyptians under Ramses II and the Hittites under Muwatalli II. And this is at Kadesh on the Orontes River. So I've tried to sort of provide you a little map here. You can really see that to some extent, just like Lagash and Umma, this too is a hotly contested border territory. Now Ramses really begins very quickly by enumerating the number of the enemy at 47,500, including 3,500 chariots. We don't have a Hittite version of this battle narrative, but Trevor Bryce has suggested that it's really quite conceivable that the Hittites could have mustered that large of a force. Although the Egyptians are successful in pushing the Hittites across the Orontes on the first day of this engagement, the Egyptians were successful only after, this is as recorded in Ramses, the Egyptian version of events, only after the pharaoh stood his ground before the arrival of his supporting troops and so-called broke the back of Hatti forever. Now keep in mind here, he really throws his troops under the bus and says, I was standing here all by myself, I was waiting for them and they just didn't come, and finally I just had to do something about it all by myself. I mean, that's essentially the narrative he gives. On the second day, however, the Egyptians were unsuccessful in removing the Hittites from the battlefield, and Ramses is forced to flee. So this is a real sort of reversal of fortune on the second day. Thereafter, the Hittites maintained control of the land in this area, and the battle really resulted in the first peace treaty in world history, which was to be conducted on the basis of parity between two equal states, concluded under the Hittite king Hattusili III, brother of Muwatalli. Okay, so this one gives us a little bit more of interest here. We have an extremely rich textual record, which is left behind by the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. We find text and relief relating to the battle at the Ramesseum in the Valley of the Kings, Abydos, Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel. The fullest account is the so-called poem of Pentaware, a virtually complete Egyptian version of the events that transpired at Kadesh. The overwhelming message here was that the Egyptian pharaoh had been victorious. This would have been particularly clear in the reliefs here, which would certainly have been viewed by Hittite diplomats coming into these Egyptian temples, making ambassadorial missions to Egypt. The carefully structured narrative was essential for the pharaoh to explain his failure. Remember, he lost at Kadesh, a demonstration that the outcome occurred only because the Hittites were disloyal and broke the rules of war. We saw a similar moral lambasting of the enemy in the text relating to the Lagash-Umma conflict. So an attendant question relates to the impetus for Ramses' extensive advertising campaign. If it was such a reversal of fortune, why would Ramses be so keen to produce such an overwhelming abundance of material that references it? The record of Kadesh in Egypt seems to be a part of a sort of turning point in royal Egyptian representation. A plethora of temple building projects initiated in the 18th dynasty provided the pharaohs with blank wall canvases on which they could advertise their exceptional military accomplishments. Spallinger argues that the Kadesh poem, a lengthy and literary version of the conflict, is a byproduct of that same movement, whereby Ramses could, and this is his quote, perpetuate his interpretation of the battle through a highly stylized and personal literary narrative to be publicly recorded in word and in picture. The visual and historiographical submergence of the Hittite version of Kadesh was active and deliberate long after the conclusion of events. So this revisionist history goes on for ages afterwards. Artistic displays of the battle appear to have been initiated already in the first decade of Ramses' reign, while the events were still fresh for all involved. Through the long reign of Ramses, the pictorial representations of the battle were revised so they don't stay static. This is clear by the rather awkward secondary insertion of the king into scenes on the temple at Abu Simbel, which had the effect of placing the pharaoh in the company of the gods. Furthermore, even following the establishment of peace between the Egyptians and the Hittites, Ramses continued to represent himself as the complete conqueror of the Hittites. This is a mytho-historicization of truth, and it's being assiduously performed, but not just performed, also re-performed, as the international dialogue about these events continues and also expands. Together with the representations of Kadesh, Ramses inaugurates a new vision of reality. Now, we don't, I think I mentioned this already, we don't have any direct Hittite accounts of this battle. And the reason for this dearth is partly due to the nature of Hittite documentation, which tends towards a cyclical focus on seasonal campaigns and serves a more exclusive audience of elites and state administrators. But despite the lack of documentation, royal annals, res gestae texts, and royal inscriptions were all being produced in Hatti during the period under discussion. Surviving fragments of these documents indicate that warfare was a popular motif in these text types. Surviving royal correspondence, which can arguably, I would argue anyway, be considered historiographic in its own right, gives us every reason to believe that Ramses' account of the events at Kadesh served to actually actively submerge a Hittite version of the battle. So this is some correspondence that helps us understand how this works. In the reign of Hattusili, Ramses II appears to have refused the release of Urhi-Teshub, an ex-king of Hatti. The Hittite king writes a hostile letter to Ramses, who quotes the Hittite king as saying, "You brought up the enmity between our land with your words. Have you forgotten the days of the enemies from the land of Hatti?" Bryce argues that this was clearly a reference to the victory claimed by the Hittites at Kadesh. Ramses was being warned that he might again find himself the victim of Hittite military wrath if he refused to give up this hostage. Ramses' reply indicates that he could not afford a challenge to the Egyptian account to go without a response, reiterating that he brought about the defeat of Muwatalli single-handedly, and this is a claim that was also made in the poem of Pentawere. This particular assertion seems to have made an impression on Near Eastern cultural consciousness in the short years after the battle, as Hattusili appears to make an ironic reference to it in the same letter where he says, this is my favorite, "Was there really no army there? Were there really no chariots there?" Okay, so he's really sort of directly addressing this idea that Ramses was all by himself and there was no army there, and he had to do it single-handedly. Additionally, in a treaty between Tudhaliya IV and a king of Amurru, the Hittite king proclaims in a matter-of-fact style, "But when Muwatalli, uncle of my majesty, became king, the men of Amurru committed an offense against him, informing him as follows: we were voluntary subjects, now we are no longer your subjects. And they went over to the king of Egypt. Them, my majesty's uncle, and the king of Egypt fought over the men of Amurru. Muwatalli defeated him, destroyed the land of Amurru by force of arms, and subjugated it." Hittite kings were relatively candid in their battlefield accounts, and one example has the Hittite king fully admit his humiliating escape from the field. So the insistence of the several generations of Hittite kings about the outcome of the Battle of Kadesh, which goes directly against the Egyptian version that we see in literature and in art, indicates that there had been what we could refer to as an active submersion of an alternative discourse. The forceful assertion of both parties regarding the outcome of the battle should be read as a perceived breach of the important symbolic reciprocal relationships that charged the international scene during this period. This is the period where we get this idea of the brotherhood of kings, where they are all sort of equal status. They are meant to receive each other in hospitality. They are meant to make alliances with one another. And the idea behind this brotherhood is that they have these sort of reciprocal relationships that dictate the total international scene in trade and commerce, but also in war. So if you could call it, right to a version of history that proclaimed a certain party victorious in an important and decisive battle was a matter of legitimacy, and it's also a matter of prestige that can't be taken lightly. My last sort of example here of this blatant, what I call blatant untruths, which is just really kind of a nice way to say lies, is a chronicle. This is going to be very common, particularly in the Neo-Babylonian period, so we are sort of moving forward in time here, which is going to be a particular purview of Babylonian scholars. An exception to the rule, however, is this last example, which is called the Synchronistic history. All of these texts, I should note, have been fully studied, but not necessarily together as a complex in this way. This text is really our only surviving full-scale Assyrian chronicle. And what it does is it records the Syro-Babylonian relations from the first half of the 15th century BC to the 8th century BC. For this text in particular, we can establish a provenance. It appeared in the library, it appeared in the library of Ashurbanipal, which is in Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, as given in its colophon, so it tells us that. Even more striking about this is its survival in 3 copies, which is very, very unusual. In this text, Babylon is accused of committing a crime, although what that crime is, the Selective, it's not clear. This has often been interpreted as their repeated violation of an Ade treaty, centered again, here we are, around a boundary line, which Grayson argues existed, of course, only in the author's imagination. The catalog here is clearly biased in that it omits mention of Assyrian military disgraces and overemphasizes the defeat and humiliation of the Babylonians at Assyrian hands. Well, it's certain that the author of the Synchronistic history was connected to the Assyrian court milieu in some intimate way. This should not automatically cause us to attribute reliability or lack thereof to this text. The thing that's quite interesting about this, and this is very rare in the ancient Near East, the claims in the Synchronistic history can be checked against a fragmentary Babylonian text, which is referred to as Chronicle P, which reports on some of the same events and demonstrates the patent falsifications in the Synchronistic history. The date of Chronicle P is extremely uncertain, so that's one of the big problems here. And while the extant fragment of the text is late Babylonian, it's not clear whether it was available to the author of the Synchronistic history and represents a Babylonian version of the Assyrian Chronicle, or whether it was written after the latter text. There is, I should note, more than one discrepancy between these chronicles, but the most blatant example in the Synchronistic history for which we find a corrective in Chronicle P is the reference to the Battle of Sugaga. In the Synchronistic history, this 14th century BC battle saw the Assyrian king Enlil-Narari defeat the Kassite king Kurigalzu, slaughtering his troops, destroying his camp, and causing a division of districts. Chronicle P recounts, however, that Kurigalzu conquered a different Assyrian king, Adad-Nirari, at Sugaga. So we're talking about a complete name change here. The chronicler writes that Kurigalzu was victorious, and he uses the same terminology to describe the devastation of the enemy troops. Okay, so again, we have this sort of sharing of terminology that we saw in the Lagash-Umma conflict. Given that we have 2 very distinct versions of the events here, so it's rather than selective omissions, we have 2, very clear versions. We can assume that somewhere along the way, somebody is committing a deliberate falsification of facts, maybe on both sides of this international dialogue. Like the inscriptions from the Lagash-Umma conflict and the Egyptian poem of Pentawere regarding the Battle of Kadesh, the synchronistic history actively submerges alternative discourses by preventing a biased version of events concerning a boundary line between two parties, which is what we've seen in all of the others, where the writer's opponent is always wrong. This behavior highlights the importance of the demarcation of territory for the definition of a successful empire, and the establishment of a border as a fundamental part of a reciprocal agreement between two powers in the ancient Near East. Our final example of untruths, or mistruths, if you will, alternative facts, whatever you want to call them, is here. These are martial accounts that come again from Assyria. But here we have two battles sort of at question here. One of them is the Battle of Dare. This is contested against the Elamites in the reign of Sargon II of Assyria, so in 720 BC. The city, which held important strategic advantages on the east-west trade route, had been hotly contested under previous Assyrian kings and did not firmly come under their control until the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III or Shalmaneser V. We know little about the tactical details of this battle. The Elamites seem to have requested the assistance of the Babylonians against the Assyrian threat, but the former were not able to reach the battlefield before weapons were drawn. The inscription of Sargon proclaims the outcome of the battle in unequivocal terms. He says, "I am the exalted prince who came face to face with Humban-Nikash, king of Elam, in the outskirts of Dare and defeated him." The statement of Sargon, however, is to be read against that of the Babylonian Chronicle, which itself relates the outcome of the battle by introducing some choice details and a little bit of superlative language. This is what the Chronicle says. In the second year of Baladan II, Humban-Nikash, king of Elam, did battle against Sargon, king of Assyria, in the district of Dare, effected an Assyrian retreat, and inflicted a major defeat upon them. Okay, so we can see, the differences here, they're clear. The Babylonian Chronicle is important for being our only dated chronicle text, copied in the reign of Darius I, so that's the Persian king you saw the Bisitun inscription from, around 500 BC. And it's unique in being the only Neo-Babylonian chronicle text known in more than one copy. The Chronicle is not the only contradiction of the Assyrian report. Merodach-Baladan, the Babylonian king who failed to arrive to battle in time, also claims to have prevented the Assyrians from entering Babylonian territory. Now, with three parties involved, it's difficult to disentangle falsehoods from truth, but that's not the point. There's another example here that can kind of help us with this. In the same chronicle, we can find similar issues when it's placed against Sennacherib's account of the Battle of Hulule in 691 BC. The king claims to have forced a coalition of Babylonians, Elamites, and allies into flight, being forced to so-called trample the bodies of their troops to save their own lives. The Chronicle, however, unequivocally reports an Assyrian retreat effected by the Elamite king Humban-Nimena. What we have in both of these cases are examples of a direct response to the attempted subversion of an alternative version of events. The response is probably produced after the submerging narrative. The latter must exist before the former. Therefore, we should consider the Babylonian Chronicles to be historiographic in that they impose an interpretive framework on historical events, an emergence that's allowed by the forceful and at times ahistorical statements of Assyrian royal texts. The abundance of this kind of inconsistency across Assyrian and Babylonian historical insertions indicates a statistically significant trend towards the active submersion and maybe emergence of military narratives doubtless an artifact of the difficult relationships between these two powerful empires in this period. Indeed, what almost all of our examples show us, from Lagash and Umma to Egypt to Assyria and Babylonia, is that royal narratives are not static, as we tend to believe, but instead they can be reactive. They can even be intentionally subversive. And maybe more importantly, they appear to have at least the possibility of engaging in international rhetoric, indeed in international discourse. Propaganda, fake news, whatever you want to call it, it is much older than we are. Now, some may say, who know these battles a little bit better, that it could be reasonably claimed that all of the military encounters that I've talked about here were tactical draws. That is, it would have been essentially unclear who exactly the victor actually was. But it was the responsibility of the king to produce a plausible and decisive explanation for any victory that he proclaims, particularly if the outcome is debatable. Although to a great extent, Mesopotamian and Egyptian kings were beholden to cosmic and literary imperatives in their accounts of these important battles. That is, there are some sort of programmatic ideologies and phraseologies that have to be included here. In this instance, we're really beyond propaganda. In fulfilling the prerequisites of kingship, we see here the development of an interpretive conception of history. And that's really important because I don't think that we give ancient people enough agency to be able to do the type of critical analysis and sort of assertions that we make in our own history. The inherent dependence of historical royal pronouncements on a mythological background meant that the creation of a discourse that was true in ideological terms means that the obsession with disunity, and this is what Fry has argued, is a narrow historical obsession, an inability to understand that there are forms of truth, meaning, and significance which are not dependent on correspondence with facts or other external criteria. So what I'm saying here is ultimately it doesn't even matter who was right. It doesn't matter who is telling the truth. But what matters here is that we have an active and intentional submersion of competing discourses. Here we're witnessing a trend towards royal interpretations, but also royal constructions of history that highlight the process of imperial revisionism that's being enacted at a very, very early period in history. In producing these texts, royal figures initiated an international dialogue that had the purpose of effectively submerging alternative discourses in text, but also in art. We also have to look at art as text. These are contested pasts. That is a genre that in itself creates submersion. Now, sort of my final word about this is that it's important to remember that the attempted submergence of a narrative can be met with a response that in turn attempts to submerge the original statement. That in itself mimics this sort of relational reciprocality that helped produce it in the first place. So that discourse and dialogue is very sort of similar to this brotherhood of kings ideology where everything is reciprocal between parties. It's just not in the way that they sort of want it to be. This is a really highly complex process. Given the audience for these royal pronouncements, the very act of silencing an alternative discourse is a process that in and of itself is disguised, having the effect of concealing even the existence of opposing material. In this case, however, we have two competing official versions of events. Notably, these contested pasts unfailingly appear, even as early as the 3rd millennium, in imperial situations where the two parties could reasonably be considered on equal military ground within their own reciprocal relationships. Importantly, the attempted submergence of a narrative can be met with a response that in turn attempts to submerge the original statement. We can thus describe a new history of dialogic, or alternatively, a dialogic of history, that is a direct result of the complicated web of international relations being forged, particularly during the Bronze Age. We've seen that this behavior becomes more complicated and more overt as we get into later periods of Mesopotamian empires, especially those after the recovery of the Bronze Age collapse, particularly Babylonia and Assyria. So my argument here then is that studying these dominant discourses and evaluating their submergence of alternative versions of history can really provide us new insights into the processes of ideological and historiographical construction in our first ages of empires. Okay, so thank you. That's all I had to say, but I'll be happy to sort of take or answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks, Jen, so much. I think Sam had to go, so I'll try to sort through the questions.
Sure.
I think Javier had a question about a kind of small point about the mace head / vase. So my recollection was that in older collections, they thought it was a vase, and then when they put together the new exhibit, they realized it was a mace head. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah,
So they had been displaying it upside down, I guess, before that.
Yeah, they had been displaying it upside down, and then they figured it out and they put it right, and then they started calling it a mace head. Yes.
Then the inscription would have been also upside down, isn't it?
Well, I mean, obviously you can't read the cuneiform inscription except for one way, but yes, if you had displayed it incorrectly, then the inscription would have been upside down. So I'm not exactly sure what had happened there with the exhibition directors.
Unless the mace itself shows the inscription upside down, depending on how the mace was meant to be read.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I haven't seen it personally myself, so I'm not 100% sure about that, but yeah.
Sid Fox had a question about audience, which is something you touched on some. So this, yeah. So the audiences are, he says, to God, self-advertisement, to subjects who might think of internal rebellion, instilling fear into the conquered in their own lands, and captives and exiled populations.
Yeah, I'm seeing this. So, okay. Before popular writing in the Iron Age, who are the audiences? God's self-advertisement to their subjects, instilling fear into the conquered. Yeah. Okay, so let me just sort of go with that first part first. I've been working on this a little bit. So, you know, we often have this idea that the thing that I'm finding in propaganda, particularly for royalty, is that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the way that it is being presented to sort of local and especially elite populations. So they'll say, oh, I completely razed this city, I destroyed everybody, I took everyone captive. But then when you actually go to the archaeological site itself, you'll find that they had actually left these very large and important symbolic buildings intact. So actually the propaganda that is disseminated to local populations and local constituencies is going to be different than that is sort of relayed at home through primarily artistic means, because the literacy rates are going to be quite low. You know, the audiences vary actually depending on where they are, geographical location, but also if you're of the elite classes, or if you're the plebs, for instance, you know, but we get the overwhelming idea that most of these inscriptions and pieces of art, monumental pieces of art and inscriptions, are meant to sort of justify behavior to the gods. And so it's not necessarily so important what the people see. What they see is that, for instance, for Ramses, the king is much bigger than everybody else. So he's more powerful and he probably won. That's the important thing for them. But let me see, when writing in Israel and Greece became aimed at the popular audience, writing became a means to memory that would transfer lessons and knowledge to later generations. Yes, exactly. So this is what I'm sort of talking about here, is that we're actually revising memory as time goes on. This is these reactions to each other's propaganda go on for centuries after the event occurs. So there's this revisionism that is like constantly in place. And so that manipulation of memory, I think, is really the most important thing that we're looking at here. So we tend to, I would definitely agree with you, we tend to sort of associate that type of manipulation of memory with people like Herodotus or Thucydides, but I think that this is actually happening much earlier. It's just in a different medium because we don't have those sort of historiographic contexts like we do for the classical period. And then, yeah, are we now going backwards in the age of multimedia and the internet where the audiences can be isolated from each other, fed only one version, and more importantly, yeah. So this is the big problem, you know, that we're working with here. Although I would argue that today is not so different than it was in the ancient Near East, because those biased histories that are being propagated by either side are really only available to those constituencies that are in close proximity, just because of the nature of travel. I mean, the only people who are going to get a different version of the story are going to be ambassadors or messengers that could potentially sort of take those messages back to where they came from and announce that, you know, well, Ramses keeps saying that he won this thing, you got to do something about it. And that's indeed what happened, probably through those correspondences. But for the most part, if you're in that time, you're only being fed that one version of the story. So in that sense, you know, the modern sort of internet is propagating a very similar kind of, you know, version of the truth. So we haven't actually come that far, is basically what I think we've learned from that. Yeah.
Yes, it also had this question about popular accounts, which is something that I've always wondered about too, you know, like, so Ramses can claim victory all he wants, but then there are going to be soldiers who are present at the battle, right? Who, yeah, so I always wonder about that kind of stuff myself.
Yeah, how did popular accounts counter this propaganda? Yeah, so we get a lot of this again in the classical period. But you're right, there are soldiers, and in particular, you know, one of these sort of conduits of information can be mercenary soldiers that would eventually sort of go back to their homes and sort of give their own version of events. But the real problem, of course, with figuring out whether we have those kinds of narratives is that they just don't exist for us, particularly in ancient Near East, because of the dominance of elite literacy and really orality. So it's going to be really hard for us to reconstruct those kinds of things. We get a little bit of that in Greece, but even then, it's hard because of the nature of texts and writing, which is really sort of dominated by the elite classes. I wish that we had more of that, but it seems like for me, in Mesopotamia, the sort of versions of the plebs, if you will, that actually comes more through sort of mythology, because those are going to be the more well-known types of literature, and those aren't really going to address these historical events in very overt terms. And so it's going to be really hard to sort of reconstruct that kind of opinion or alternative version of events for the ancient Near East. I'd love to give you a straight answer for that, but I just don't know if there is one. Yeah.
I was wondering too, if I could ask, is there a way in which what you're talking about intersects with some of the stuff that Seth Richardson and maybe others have argued about, the way that states claim a kind of territorial authority and monopoly over violence that in practice they may or may not actually be able to substantiate? Is there a way in which these connect in some way? Because you've been talking more about sort of international fake news, but I also wondered if the sort of domestic side could be got at the way Seth has tried to.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, because I was thinking about it sort of more in the broader international sphere. but yeah, that sort of claim making is being done particularly in art, and that would be particularly in the Assyrian period, because we can't really expect people to be reading these chronicles that are, these competing chronicles that are written between these Babylonian and Assyrian scholars. So that sort of artistic program that proclaims victory over all of these other cities and proclaims the sort of dominance of their empire is the kind of fodder that you would expect people to take in as a evidence for the complete and utter domination of one state over the other. And so that's the kind of grassroots, I guess, propaganda that could be going on here. But again, you know, the problem here is the text and the literacy rates. So it's going to be hard to get a feel for what, you know, the actual people, the constituencies of these kings are feeling about, you know, their proclamations against the domination or the abilities of other states to hold true empire. Oh, that's an interesting question. If there's no evidence that these claims target the bulk of the population, can we call it propaganda? Yeah, I mean, so that goes down to what is the definition of propaganda? You know, I mean, that's going to be very sort of, for me, propaganda is, you know, a type of assertion that is meant to persuade. And so that means that if that is the case, these literary texts are mainly meant to persuade the elite classes, and these pieces of art, monumental art, are mainly meant to persuade the sort of, I don't want to call them lower classes, but the people who are not in elite circles in these areas. And I think that's why you can often get the combination of the two. So the kings in these areas know that you can't just send a letter to somebody in another empire and say, oh, by the way, I defeated you. I just wanted you to know that I'm telling everybody that. But those letters have to be matched by artwork that could sort of reinforce those ideas among their own local constituents. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it is propaganda in that, you know, there is a very concerted effort at persuasion. But if you know, take a narrower view of propaganda, then it may be that it's harder to call it that, and that it may need to have some other moniker. Yeah.
So there's no reason to believe that these accounts have sort of oral correspondences. You know, I'm thinking of like something like that, like the Epitaphios in Athens, right, where there are occasions where people are gathered and some kind of account is made of. Yeah. We don't really think that kind of stuff is happening on any kind of ritual occasions or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some suggestion, for instance, that the Bisitun inscription was read aloud, and maybe that's how Herodotus knows of it, or at least knows the constituent parts of it. But I'm not sure, you know, and for instance, we know that Enuma Elish is ritually recited every year. So it's not impossible that as a part of some of those rituals in which some of these other sort of mythological texts are being recited, that there isn't some accounting of the previous year. I mean, that's the whole idea behind royal annals anyway, is to sort of account the previous military victories in that year. So it's not impossible, but I don't know that we have any firm evidence for that.
Okay, great. Any other questions?
Well, thank you all for.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this was great.